Okay, we have a very interesting article here, um, and I just wanted to quickly read it and then offer some feedback after reading the article, some commentary, something that we've been covering for a while and monitoring, and it's something that we view ourselves as really passionate about. And let's just jump into it and then go from there. So, um, published on the 27th of June, quite recently. Title of the article is World Dangerously Headed for Food Wars, Top Commodity Trader Warns. And the article begins, Sunny Verghese, CEO of Olam Agri, a Singapore-based agricultural trading firm, spoke at the Redburn Atlantic and Rothschild Consumer Conference last week, warned the audience that the world is heading towards a period of food wars as geopolitical wildfires spread across the globe. We have fought many wars over oil. We will fight bigger wars over food and water, Verghese said, quoted by the Financial Times, adding that food protectionism has forced some governments to boost domestic food supplies, exacerbating food inflation. And the article continues. He pointed out that a surge in non-tariff trade barriers in 2022 in response to the war in Ukraine, 1,266 from 154 countries by his count, has sparked an exaggerated demand-supply imbalance. Food prices have soared in recent years, whether due to adverse weather conditions sparked by El Nino or the war in Ukraine. These prices are likely to remain elevated for years to come. Verghese said wealthier countries have been building surpluses of strategic commodities due to global uncertainty, which has helped push food prices higher. India, China, everybody has got buffer stocks, he said, adding, that is only exacerbating the global problem. The latest data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations shows that global food prices are beginning to rise once again and remain well above pre-COVID levels. What's clear is that the most impoverished countries are extremely vulnerable to surging food prices and shortages, and these areas are at the highest risk of social unrest. However, wealthier economies aren't immune, as we've seen evidence with U.S. consumers pulling back on food spending while complaining about the failure of Bidenomics. FT provided two recent examples of food protectionism that is likely to continue in the years ahead, exacerbating food security risk for the world's most vulnerable. In 2022, Indonesia banned palm oil exports to protect the local market, while last year India imposed export restrictions on certain types of rice in an effort to curb rising domestic prices ahead of parliamentary elections, after a volatile monsoon disrupted production and spurred fears of a supply shortage. The risks are skewed toward more food export curbs as the world splinters into a multipolar state full of conflict and chaos. Protectionism might be the worst thing for food security and yet another reason why prices will linger at elevated levels for years to come. This is yet more evidence that Americans need to ditch Walmart and the food industry complex and support local farmers so they can beef up local supply chains to minimize risks abroad. End of article. So now we have our critique of this article. And as illustrated here in the graph, it's basically noting the price of food, the food price index, which is created by the United Nations Food and Agriculture World Food entity, so probably a research arm within the United Nations, which is paid by funds and tax dollars from every country around the world that's a member of the UN. So yes, it's not quite where it was of Corona times, but it's probably going to surpass that very soon. So the article is stating three things that came to mind when it comes to food wars. Number one, it cited the two case studies of the 2022 Indonesia banning of palm oil, and we can speak specifically to that because we've lived it and we're very familiar with it. So Indonesia, as part of the constitution, does have a social element as one of the five Panchasilas, and um, there are several items, commodity or goods, you could say, including petrol at the gas stations, which are price controlled. So this is sort of a socialist delivery of what was guaranteed and enshrined in the founding of the Republic of Indonesia, What happened in 2022 with palm oil exports was that they were worried about a bullwhip effect, and there was price gouging. And we can also speak to in Indonesia when it comes to seaweed. There's a lot of internal. There's two prices. There's the price domestically of seaweed per kilogram, and then there's the price of exporting seaweed per kilogram. And then the bottleneck of if you want to get a higher price by exporting versus selling locally, you have to go through certain licensed and a restricted number of licenses per province. So if you're a farmer and you want to get a better price for export versus selling locally, you still have to deal with middlemen, which will control one of the three licenses per province. Going back now to what this article talks about in Indonesia for palm oil exports, what happened in 2022 was that as the pandemic was starting to finally taper out and Indonesia was finally reopening more or less, middle of 2022, right before then, there was a run at price gouging at the local markets, and the government stepped in order to ensure that local Indonesians, the citizens of Indonesia, would get the price security on palm oil. And pretty much overnight, they said exporting is a no-no because what the exporters are going to get is a higher price and more profit, and that is an inconvenience to the citizens of Indonesia, especially if it's an Indonesian-made product. And that was the justification. And if you believe in Pancasila, then of course it makes complete sense. And that bullwhip effect and that price gouging was mitigated overnight. That's what the government stepped in Indonesia. When we're looking at the second example of parliamentary elections in India, can't really speak to that, but it seems that there was, it says disrupted production and spurred fears of a supply shortage. So that was regarding rice. And so the other point of this article that we want to talk about is the geopolitical comment, which is the second to final paragraph of the article, which it says that the world splinters into a multipolar state full of conflict and chaos. That is correct that the world is splintering into a multipolar state. Conflict and chaos existed during the Cold War with a bipolar state, and the conflict and chaos has existed since 1990 with the existence of a unipolar state after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91. And finally, the final point of the three that came to mind is the final sentence, which talks about a sort of call to action, but it's a domestic call to action for the United States. It says, this is yet more evidence that Americans need to ditch Walmart and the food industrial complex and support local farmers so they can beef up local supply chains to minimize risks abroad. So the article basically states that this is a call to action for Americans, who are probably the majority of the people reading this article, or who this article is geared to, about sustainable and being able to provide for oneself, and cutting out all the big retailers, etc., etc. It might be too little, too late. Most Americans are completely dependent on these big supermarket chains or whatever you will, but it's better late than never. I think other countries are much further ahead when it comes to small farmers and farmers markets and being closer to the source. But let's see if Americans can bridge that gap. So those are the three comments of this article. We can speak certainly personally to some of the things going on here in Southeast Asia. But having said that, the premise of the article, the title of the article, and the subject matter of the article is pretty much spot on, although it might be a little bit overplayed. So if this gentleman, Mr. Sunny Verghese, based in Singapore, CEO of Olam Agri, said that we have fought many wars over oil, we will fight bigger wars over food and water, could be a little bit of hyperbole at this point in time, because it seems that desalinization of water is here already. And if there were to be wars fought, then it's a knee-jerk reaction of countries to basically nationalize or at least mobilize food security. So it seems like that only if there were to be wars, then it's sort of chicken and egg, or what comes first? Is the war leading to fighting over food, or is fighting over food leading to war? So that's a little bit ambiguous. So the quote itself was a little bit, hyperbolic in my personal opinion, but it is true that fighting over food is always a reality because that's what market prices and commodities and futures is about on a day-to-day basis when markets are pricing in various commodity prices. But I wouldn't call that necessarily warfare. We would just call that market forces in action by both big and small players. Okay, so very happy to report that article. We've been covering food security, and this covers the whole spectrum of individual nation states making decisions. In this case, the CEO of a company that trades agricultural commodities, it seems, in Singapore, and then a little bit of geopolitical comments touched in there, and then a little bit of stateside call to action for most of the readers of this article. But overall, very interesting article, much appreciated, and looking forward to continuing to cover this topic of food security. And this article certainly starts to sound the alarm. Interesting article, so much appreciated for it. Looking forward to covering another one soon on a similar theme.